Hey everyone! So today I'm beginning a new series of Dorico videos specifically on page and part formatting. When I do private lessons with people on Dorico to help them increase their productivity, this is the number one thing that people request is assistance with making the parts look right and understanding how to use the page templates, how to make use of the layout options, and all of the automatic spacing features in Dorico. And because this is such a huge topic, I'm going to be breaking this apart into several shorter videos so that you can refer back to the specific topic that you are looking for, since watching through an hour and a half long video might be a little bit cumbersome. Dorico's page layout features are absolutely amazing, so I don't want to chase anyone away, but once you start to understand the system, this is such a powerful tool and can make your music look amazing. So for this first installment, we're going to be talking about the engraving options and the notation options that you'll probably use on pretty much every single one of your Dorico projects. So let's dive right in. Now, I know a lot of you probably logged onto this video looking for information on part and page formatting, but I'm here to tell you there's a couple of steps we really need to take before we worry about formatting, which is the engraving options and the notation options on our document. So whenever I go to start a series of documents, let's say I'm publishing big band charts or I'm working on saxophone quartets, I like to make sure that all of my defaults are just the way I want them so that when I apply them to a document, they will look uniform and it will make it so that everything looks perfect when we go into the actual page formatting. So let's dive in and take a quick look at the engraving and notation options here in Dorico Pro. Okay, so I have loaded up a big band arrangement I did of Strawberry Fields from the Beatles, and in this particular case, this is a document that I have not used my most current settings on. So before we do too much page formatting, the number one thing we want to do is make sure that our engraving options are set. Now, there are literally thousands of different options that are all controlled by this engraving option, which can make you go crazy thinking, do I need to look at every single one? And the answer is absolutely not. Almost all of these settings are perfect the way they come from the factory at Dorico, and I would not go in trying to change them because I think it will probably make you crazy. However, there are a couple of areas that I really want to point out that you should think about before you start in your page formatting, because it is going to affect how your music looks on the page, which will then again affect how many measures are on a stave and how the music prints. So that's why these are so important. The other element here is that once we save these as a default, which is this lower left-hand corner here, now we can load our settings into any document we create in Dorico, and anytime we create a new document, it will pull in these default settings that we choose. So all of our music looks the same, and it has a really great uniform vibe to it, which is what most publishers do, so why can't we as copyists and composers do that? Now, I don't have time in this video to go through every single one of these, but I want to highlight a couple of different ones that I think have some really interesting and some really important elements in them. The first one is the bar repeats, which allows us the option to choose whether or not we want to have the little number that indicates how many times we have repeated the exact same piece of music. Pretty darn handy. Under bar lines and under repeats, you will see the option for whether or not we want our repeat signs to have the little wings on them. I think the wings are amazing because it helps the players see the repeat sign easier, and so I think that's a really important step. So that's one that I always turn on and save as a default. The next two categories, which can be gigantic, are the chord diagrams and the chord symbols. Now, if you have not gone through the chord symbols and checked out all the various options, check out my videos on chord symbols here in Dorico, but definitely take a look through this whole section. I have never seen any one of their presets that I think satisfies everything I'm looking for in a set of chord symbols, so it's definitely one that I would highly recommend that you look at and make changes to so that your chord symbols look just the way you want them to. The next couple options that I think are really important is taking a look at your lyrics and your language. Now, this was a new one on me because a Dorico student sent me a document where all the parts came up with German titles for the instruments, and we thought, what in the world? And that's when we went in looking for this option, which allows us to change the instrument names. So if you're going to be sending your music overseas, you have the option of having Dorico automatically translate the names of your instruments to whatever language you're sending the music to. We also have options for lyrics, which are important because, again, lyrics have a lot to do with the spacing of our music. And so if we don't have our options set for lyrics, we can really end up with some very bizarre problems when we're trying to create vocal parts. I also come down and I set my rehearsal markers. Do I want letters? Do I want bar numbers? And how do I want them to appear on the document? I think this one's really important, and you should definitely take some time to make sure this one looks correctly, because again, if you see these options right here, the position of rehearsal marks at the start of a system, that really affects spacing, because this top option will allow the staves to get closer together, whereas this one will push your staves farther apart. By the same token, repeat endings are another one that I think are really important to come in and take a look at and make sure they meet your needs. The repeat marks, aka DSL Coda, DCL Coda, we want these to be displayed exactly how we want them, and we'd also like to go in and change up some of their sizing. It's not really easily findable in there, but under engrave options, if you think that the symbol for 2 coda is too small, here is your scale factor for how big that's going to be. And oftentimes I'll make that larger because I think the coda symbol itself is too small. Now the font, the words that say 2 coda are changed in a different location, but at least now we know where we can make the actual symbol larger. And finally, we have a couple of hidden ones in here that I think are really worth pointing out when we're talking about page layouts. The first one is spacing gaps. Now, the spacing gaps are something that really sometimes I find to be a little bit overzealous. And what it is how far away from the left bar line is the first object of music. And you can see gap before bar line is a half. And then number 2 is minimum gap after bar line, which in this case is also a half. Now, by default, I think Dorico does a pretty good job with this spacing, but I remember in Finale, it always used to have a humongous space before the start of the music, and it was always really hard to find. So I wanted to point this one out so that you could decide whether or not you have too much white space in your music. Now, again, we want to have lots of white space around our bar lines, but sometimes there's just a little bit too much. So this will, again, affect your page layout quite a bit. So this might be a place to come and look if your music is spreading out too far. There are also options here for how much space is around the key signature, the time signature, and other elements. So again, these have a huge effect on the part's overall look, and that's why it's so important to get these set as a default. To be clear, I have this basically set at the defaults from Dorico. So if you look at these and you think, I don't know, they look pretty good to me, don't sweat it. I think they're pretty good right out of the box. So the final category that I think is really important under engrave options for page layout is the staff labels. This gives us options for how far the staff label is from the edge of the music and things like that. Now, to be clear, I have left this at the default that it came with in Dorico. I think it looks good, but this would be another place that's really going to affect especially the look of your score. So don't hesitate to come in here and read through these options and see if any of these are not quite working the way you want. For example, do you want to label each instrument group by the instrument and then have it put the 1 and 2, or do you want them fully labeled? I can make this little change here, and you can see now it takes up a little less space on my score here. And if I go back to the full instrument names, you can see it could save you some white space. So again, in page layout, this could be a really handy feature. I go back and forth a lot on this because I think it can look good, but it can also look strange. So it's up to you to decide how you want your scores to look. Okay, the next area we're going to look at is the notation options. Now, just like the engrave options, the notation options have a lot to do with how the music will print, which will affect your page layout a lot. Again, you'll want to save yourself a good set of defaults once you get this looking the way you want. Do remember, though, you can always come back in here and change something and resave it as a default if once you start working on your document, you think, I don't think this looks quite right. You can always change it. And if on one specific document you need to change one item, that's also possible. Now, again, just like with the engrave options, there's a lot of these that I really don't mess around with much, but there's a few of them that I really like to point out. The first one is beaming groups. You will definitely want to go through all of these options to make your beaming groups look correct. I have spent a lot of time going through here and making sure these ones look the way I want, and it does change a little bit depending on the document I'm working on. But there are a lot of these where I really and truly want them to be different than the way Dorico comes out. By default, Dorico likes to do a lot more beaming than I do. I like my notes broken up a little bit more, and especially if I was doing a lot more vocal music, I'd want even fewer beams. So I highly encourage you to go through this and make your music look the way you want. Another element is condensing. If you're going to do condensing, like the first and the second trumpet part squished together in the score, you'll definitely want to go through this section because it will make a big difference on how your music looks. The other one that's really important is note groupings. So beaming has to do with small notes like eighth notes, 16th notes, and so on. Beat grouping has to do with the whole measure, and specifically quarter notes, eighth notes. The best example of this is in 4/4. Do you want to have a half note on beat 2 that goes into beat 3, or do you want that imaginary bar line to split the note? And this is where you're going to find that here in the beat grouping. This affects your music a lot, and again, I highly encourage you to go through this and decide how you want it to be. The final one, which I change constantly, is the percussion notation. There are different standards for percussion notation in both jazz, classical, concert band, orchestra, etc., etc. And so I oftentimes go in here and I change these a lot. I do like to have the truncated shortest note because most percussion instruments don't have duration, meaning if you hit a snare drum, it's not actually ringing out, it just is what it is. And so I don't like having these extra ties and stuff. It looks very bizarre. And I go back and forth between having the single voice and having the multi-voice. And again, that depends on the style of music and the kind of percussion I'm notating for. There's only 4 or 5 options in here, but like I said, I change these a lot, and this has a lot to do with how good my music will look. So there's a quick overview of the engraving and notation options that I always look at when I start a document and I'm getting ready to do part formatting. Again, these are things that I need to have set up before I go into my page layout, because if I was to go back and change any of these, it can affect my page layout. So make sure you get all your engraving and notation options set first, which will really speed you up in the end. I hope you'll stick around for the next video in the series where we're going to start looking at page formatting and layout options. So thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying the videos, please think about subscribing and definitely give a like. I really like engaging in comments, so don't hesitate to shoot me a question, and have a great day.